This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to start by talking about inequality in the United States. How does it arise? What, if anything, should be done about it? Then we're going to blast off into space for the second half of the show. Well, not really, we'll still be sitting right here. But we're going to discuss the problems of space debris in the Earth's orbit and what economic reasoning can tell us what can or should be done about the problem. My first guest is Dr. Robert Subrick. Dr. Subrick is an associate professor of economics at James Madison University, and he earned his Ph.D. from George Mason University, where we were classmates together. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So let's start with what is inequality that you care about here that we want to talk about today?
I'm mainly looking at income inequality in the United States. It's pretty well known that it has risen quite a bit over the past few decades. Beginning sometime in the early 1970s. It depends a little on how you measure things, but the trend, no matter what you look at, it's been the rich are gaining income faster than the poor are gaining their income.
So, you know me, I'm a bit skeptical about measures of inequality. And it's not so much the measurement, but just why do I care? It's the different types of inequality. There's inequality of outcome, like incomes, but there's also process inequality of treating everybody equal. Why is income inequality important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to view the two as not separate. The process generates the distribution, and one way to think about if the process is working or not is to look at the outcomes. So maybe it's all simply because some people work harder, they work more hours per day, they go to school longer, they have technical skills that few people have, and that's plausible. But it also could be the case that something else is going on and people are using the process to enrich themselves.
Okay, fair enough. But even still, but another part of me that's skeptical is, well, it's income inequality, but Bill Gates might be however many millions times higher income than me, but he doesn't live a million times longer or fly around the world a million times faster. He's in a private jet instead of coach maybe, but we're probably a lot less unequal in outcome than our income says.
Right, so consumption isn't that different when you go from the very top to the very bottom. Right, everyone has a television. Right, they may be different sizes, but generally for a lot of basic stuff, or what we think is basic in the United States, there's still some inequality, but it generally viewed as a lot less than just pure income. Although over the past few decades, consumption inequality actually has been tracking pretty well with rising income inequality. So there are periods you could make the case that they were working against each other, so to speak, but they also seem to be that the rich now their consumption is going up quite a bit.
So the point is there still is a big gap between the inequality of income and consumption, but they're both trending in the same direction. Okay, so as a market process guy, if we're trading in the marketplace and someone's really entrepreneurial, they create a better product, they make other people wealthier, but they got wealthier too, even faster. The rising tide lifting the other boats. This type of inequality doesn't seem bad to me.
No, I agree. I don't think it's bad, but it's not clear to me that that's the only thing that's going on. Yes, there's Steve Jobs. Right, he provided products people like, and they voluntarily give up their money for it. But there's other people out there who think of, say, lawyers or retired presidents.
Both groups that we should smash.
Who seem to be making a lot of money that doesn't seem to be tied into productivity or really satisfying consumer demand.
So tell me a little bit more about let's take, instead of former presidents, let's stick with lawyers. How are they creating inequality that could be bad?
So lawyers get paid a lot compared to the average American, and that was not always true. Lawyers have been very successful in restricting their numbers. It's very difficult or costly to become a lawyer. Once you finish your undergraduate degree, you go to college, you go to law school. That's an additional 3 years. Then you have to join the bar. That's another entry restriction that's in place. So they're able to artificially prop up their wages through just simply supply restrictions. But also, you could think of lawyers as somebody who gives you advice to buy their product, because you as a consumer aren't really sure what you're buying because of the complexities of the legal system. And there aren't really good reputational mechanisms yet to really judge the quality of a lawyer. A lot, sometimes it's luck. A lot of it's thinking about the judges. There seems to be more randomness in some court decision making than people are comfortable with, and it makes it very hard for them to judge the lawyer quality. So this is another reason that sort of lawyers, you go to a lawyer and they tell you how much of their product to buy, and you do it because you don't have the information otherwise. And they also are they're in charge of the legal system, which gives them kind of a monopoly-like status. And like any good monopolist, there's not much incentive, if they're protected, there's not much incentive to innovate and actually reduce costs like we think of how markets usually respond.
So some of this inequality is from lawyers having high income that market forces don't push back down to a kind of normal rate of return?
Right, that's part of it. But also, and this is the problem that might be faced the United States, or at least people in the United States are concerned with now, is it's the really rich who have lawyers.
So it's not that the inequality is being driven by the earnings of the lawyers per se.
Right.
It's something else.
Yes, the lawyers are expensive to hire, so who can buy them or hire them, and it's the rich. And then the rich can use the lawyers to help manipulate the legal and political system to protect them from market competition.
So give me an example of how this works.
So one example of this is you think of intellectual property rights. Right, I think it's Apple makes a lot of money, or it's Microsoft rather, who makes a lot of money off of just simply patents that they have bought and they never intend to use. There are good ideas out there that no one can use, really, without paying for it, and this is what Microsoft has been able to do as a way to sort of keep up. They get, I forget, it's an insane number of profits they get per year just collecting off patent fees. They're not really doing anything, they just bought them up. Where if you can think of a world with no patents, you get much more equalizing force, the sharing of technology, and more innovation.
Maybe. That's going to be a topic for another show sometime. I think we need to do intellectual property rights. So how about an example then that's not from intellectual property rights? Is this something where, I think of a rivalrous process, a healthy market economy, new entrants come in and challenge people. That's got to be part of the story.
International trade treaties. There are a lot of lawyers involved with this now. If you ever sit down and look through them, there are lawyers representing various interests in the United States who don't want to compete against foreign firms. So, and they seem a free trade treaty you would think is a page or two long. How many words do you need to say, open up trade? But they're really, hundreds and hundreds of pages with exceptions for very specific industries.
So that would certainly be one area. And then, of course, putting regulatory barriers in place, right? Things that might even cost the big guys, but cost the small guys proportionately even more.
Yes. It's right. The relative costs are what matter, and it's the larger, the existing firms really, who have had time to develop connections with politicians in the legal profession more broadly, also who have money to spend, are able to go down this path of influencing the rules to protect their incomes.
So this is basically things that market competition, international trade maybe is a clear example. Mm-hmm. Freer markets, more goods coming in would challenge the privileged position of some 1%er who's making money without competition here, but the lawyers put up the barrier that stop it is the story of why our inequality would be getting bigger. So do you have any knowledge of, so if everybody were using lawyers though, it shouldn't impact inequality, right?
No, but we'd all be poor.
Right. No doubt we'd all be poor. But so it must be disproportionate then of who's using lawyers and who's not.
Oh, it's overwhelmingly corporations now. This started back in the 1970s, at least that's as far as the data that I've seen goes, that you don't see a lot of lawyers handling small little cases. You have, basically there's the flat fee legal world, and that's who the middle class and poor deal with. And those are things like an uncontested divorce or filing a will. But then, because they're only a few $100s, versus it's a lot of cases now you look, it's thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, and the money to be made for lawyers is in the corporate world. So an overwhelming percentage now, that's where they work. They don't deal with real disputes that you would think the courts are about, like an individual's battle with the state government or the federal government. Not many lawyers deal with that anymore. They really are just working, altering business rules.
So it's just the rich who are using the lawyers, they alter the business rules, and it's for the benefit of just the rich.
More or less, yes.
So going forward then, what can be done about it?
Well, there's a little bit of hope on the horizon. And it's following the Great Recession. Lawyers took a real hit. Right? Students didn't go as much. Average starting salary began to fall, and also people have learned you can outsource a lot of legal services, which is driving down prices. So the hope, I think, is maybe there won't be as many lawyers in the future.
No, won't be as many lawyers in the future as some of this outsourcing cuts into the demand for them overall. And presumably then that would also have an effect on the distribution of who uses the lawyers.
Right. It should become more accessible to the middle and lower class, the middle class and the lower middle class.
So the question then becomes, Bob, and you don't have a crystal ball here, but as they start using more, will it just be more rent seeking for them? And everybody is just pilfering each other from pocket to pocket? Or will it be more of a check on the big guys who are, because I could imagine a world where I prefer the increasing inequality of the current distribution to more equal, but everybody equally rent seeking.
I think I hope for the latter, that there becomes more things that are contested. So when there's various impediments to firms opening up and for more competition to take place, that lawyers will move in that direction. And then be able to counter the vested interests.
All right. Well, very interesting, Bob. Thanks for joining us today.
All right. Thank you.
Space debris is building up in the Earth's orbit. Can private property rights help solve this problem, or is government regulation the answer? Stick around to find out.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Alex Salter. Dr. Salter is an assistant professor of economics here in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He's also a comparative economics research fellow with our very own Free Market Institute. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here.
So we're going to talk about space debris today. I think this is our first out of space episode for Free to Exchange. But let's start off by just defining what it is that we're talking about. What's space debris?
So NASA defines space debris as any man-made object in orbit around the Earth that no longer serves a useful purpose. Interestingly, although that seems like something that would be pretty intuitive, there's no internationally agreed upon definition of space debris. But that's the one that NASA uses.
Okay. How dangerous is it?
Right now, not very. I think the best estimate that I've seen has the probability of a piece of space debris colliding with a useful satellite and therefore ruining it. Over the life of a spacecraft, that's about 1 in 1,000, so not very high. The problem is that over the next 50 to 200 years, a fairly long time horizon, if debris collides with other debris and creates more and more pieces, we have a snowballing effect, what scientists call the Kessler Syndrome. And that might make the valuable Earth orbits where we can park communication satellites so hard to use that basically we won't be able to rely on these technologies that we take for granted in our daily lives.
And I suppose if it got bad enough, even in danger, like blasting through it, right?
Sure, it would be even difficult to get anything beyond that if we wanted to have increased voyages to Mars or even go back to the moon or something like that.
So how is this an economic problem?
So it's interesting because most people have exclusively paid attention to the technological aspects of it. There's debris out there, what machines can we make to go and get it? What I think people aren't paying enough attention to is, like you said, the economic aspects. You can think of orbit as a common pool resource, something that it's hard to exclude people from, but once you get the benefits of it, then those benefits spread out to other people. And so if you have basically a satellite going around the Earth in orbit, in low Earth orbit, or maybe geosynchronous orbit, it's really hard to exclude someone from accessing that. But because it's not a privately owned space, it's not like terrestrial real estate.
You can't put a fence around it
exactly.
and say your satellite isn't allowed.
Exactly. It's very hard to incentivize people to take proper care of it because it's costly. It's expensive to make sure that you deorbit your satellite after its useful lifespan. But of course, if nobody has an incentive to take care of it and it gets cluttered, we get the problems that we just discussed.
So maybe this is worth stating. What are the various things that are the space debris out there and how do they get there?
Sure. So there's old satellites that are no longer useful. There's upper launch bodies from rockets. There's solid waste that actually come out of rocket engines after they're used. Those are some of the more common ones.
It's basically been a dumping ground as people have been using it, right? They're leaving their trash behind is the problem.
That's exactly it. So the first piece of space debris was the launch body from Sputnik 1. in 1957.
Started with the commies, I knew it. And then it's just built up like that.
And then it's just built up then. In 1961, there was a discontinuous jump as the US started putting more and stuff out there. In 2007, I believe, the Chinese actually conducted a purposeful anti-satellite test where they collided an old satellite with another piece of debris. And that was the single largest piece of space debris pollution in the history of space debris. Another big one happened in 2009 when an old military satellite owned and operated by Russia accidentally collided with another piece of debris.
So in economics here, the real problem, right, is it's not that we don't want people to put any debris up there, right?
Of course. The problem is that it's a problem where it seems like if we could define and enforce property rights, there wouldn't be a problem. But property rights are really costly to enforce in this situation. How do I define a property right to a piece of orbital space? Is it a physical volume? If so, how much? Like you said, you can't put a fence around it.
So really if I was going to put on like my standard economist hat instead of my comparative institutional type hat, I think standard economists would say, this sounds like an externality problem. It means a spillover cost, basically. We want people to use the common space up there, but we want to them to take account of how leaving that stuff up there could impact others. You know the classic solution.
The classic solution is the...
tax it.
Right, the Pigovian tax. The idea is people aren't taking account of their actions on the effects of their actions on others, so they're doing too much of the activity. Disincentivize that by taxing it. Theoretically, that works great. In practice, of course, if our goal is economic efficiency, we have no idea how big to make the tax. There's an insurmountable knowledge problem if we wanted to actually rationally price how valuable orbital space is. And so there's been some discussion of that in the literature, but I don't think it's received the attention that it deserves.
Smart people couldn't just figure out the optimal tax to take account of the collisions?
You could write down a mathematical problem that gives you some answer, but those are things that need to emerge as part of a market process. You don't have access to those cost and benefit informations on hand. But there's no market here, precisely because property rights are costly to define and enforce. We have no knowledge-generating mechanisms that can tell us how to optimally set that tax rate.
So they'd basically just be making stuff up and guessing.
Putting it slightly uncharitably, yes, that's exactly what they would be doing in that sort of a situation.
Well, if taxes aren't the answer, should government just directly regulate what people are allowed to leave up there or recapture some of it?
It depends on what you mean by regulation. I think what would be really fruitful in this case is to further clarify the rules of the game. So as comparative institutional economists, we obviously care very much about the rules that govern economic activity. And part of the reason that you're getting this undesirable result is in part because the rules aren't very clear. Again, no consensus on what constitutes space debris. The various international treaties also that the spacefaring nations have signed actually make it difficult to mitigate and remove pieces of debris. For example, if I wanted to, if I'm a US firm or the US government, it doesn't matter. If I wanted to go up there and get a piece of debris and the mission goes bad and I lose my spacecraft and it inadvertently damages, say, a Chinese satellite, the Chinese can actually demand that the US make payments to it for reparations under international law. So
This is actually a kind of bizarre rule, if I'm understanding it. If you go up to try to reclaim something but damage someone in the process, you're liable.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just send something up there and leave it there and it damages somebody, you're not liable?
Interestingly, that is one implication of that line of reasoning. Again, the rules of the game don't make a whole lot of sense here. To compound the fact, one of the treaties actually stipulates that governments retain ownership of the objects that they put up there. So imagine that you have an old satellite that nobody uses anymore. You want to go and get it because it's obviously debris. Another government could say, no, that's still useful and it's ours, so you can't touch it. And they might try and extract concessions on completely unrelated things to go and get that piece of debris out there.
Well, this is bizarre. This is as if you're driving down the road and you throw your can out the car, but then you retain ownership to the can and no one else can clean it off the road.
Mm-hmm. It's a very bizarre set of rules, and the reason that actually makes a certain amount of sense is because even an old satellite is a valuable resource. There's going to be some prospects for in-orbit and in-situ manufacturing sometime in the next 100 years. What are old satellites? That's a bunch of valuable resources that are already outside of Earth's gravity well. It would cost somewhere between $5 and $10 billion to put up the aluminum that we use to make spacecraft, just to get it into orbit.
You mean the stuff that's junk hanging out there
Yeah.
right now, it costs $5 to $10 billion to move that much?
Exactly.
So it's a raw material for future space construction.
Precisely, and countries can actually claim that, when in fact they might be looking for strategic bargaining on concessions on completely unrelated things.
Can you compare this to maritime law or some other institution like that?
It's similar. There's been a lot of talk in particular about maybe solving the space debris problem by applying the law of salvage. So modifying international treaties to explicitly say, okay, if you're going on a debris removal mission, maybe the ownership rules change, maybe the liability rules change. But you can see why it would be pretty costly to change the rules, because it's not clear that it's in any given nation state's interest to agree to those changes. And agreements among nation states have to be self-enforcing by definition,
So where is it internationally right now? Are people trying to negotiate this, or is everybody just, well, as politicians tend to do, like our budget deficit and unfunded liabilities, just kicking it down the street and saying, well, worry about it when space is all cluttered up?
There's some efforts to take care of it right now. So there are some efforts to make legal clarifications to what's debris. There's some efforts to get the various space organizations of each country to better enforce deorbiting guidelines. So obviously, if you have a satellite up there, eventually it's going to fall back to Earth. If you're far enough away, 36,000 kilometers is where geosynchronous orbit stops. Geosynchronous orbit starts. If you have a satellite
What's
up
that
there,
mean?
Geosynchronous orbit basically means that the object in orbit doesn't move relative to the Earth. So it's as if it's standing above the same spot relative to the ground.
Thanks.
If it's up there, it's almost never going to fall back to Earth. It can stay up there essentially forever. Stuff that's in low Earth orbit, between 160 and 2,200 kilometers, that can decay between a couple of days and a couple of years. And so the idea is to put things in orbit that will eventually decay, so you won't have this stuff staying up there forever and colliding, and then that causes all the problems that we previously mentioned. But, of course, compliance with the various spacefaring agencies' guidelines is below the threshold necessary to keep space debris on the right side of the death spiral.
Death spiral. Now, have some people proposed using auctions or anything like that for some of this debris?
That's, I think, the most interesting proposal. Auctioning off a set value of saying you can go get this stuff. What you basically do is have a government ask for bids to go get a piece of debris, either to remove it or, what's more likely, move it somewhere where it's likely to do less damage, and then hold it there. Like you noticed before, it's a valuable resource. Eventually we're going to need that stuff to make repairs in orbit, so that material is valuable, so I can auction off the right to go get it. You still run up against some various liability concerns if things go wrong, but under existing international legal rules, I think that that's the most profitable way to go forward.
So you don't have a global treaty necessary. It would just be the U.S. government could auction off the rights to the U.S. government.
Exactly. U.S. does U.S. stuff, Russia does Russian stuff, Chinese does Chinese stuff. It would be unilateral action, and it's not perfect. But under the rules of the game that we currently have, it's the best we have.
And just real quick in the last minute here, there would be some market relevant characteristics going on there of figuring out who should have valuable resources, right?
Absolutely, because now we have a bidding process. So the source of the purchasing power is a government, which means that it's not a complete market, it's a quasi-market, but at least you still have some of that knowledge-generating features of pricing in terms of who's actually going to go up there and remove the thing.
Sounds to me a whole lot better than just letting NASA go collect it to find out maybe who can make best use of the stuff if it's up there.
If we can't modify the rules of the game, which I really hope that we can in the coming years, then I do think that paying people to go get the stuff and move it is really the best way to go.
Well, me too. Well, thanks for joining us today, Alex.
Thanks, Ben.
On today's show, we talked about two areas that, frankly, I don't really spend very much time thinking about. On the second half of the show, we talked about space debris. And most people will think about things in space as purely scientific questions. Our second guest showed us the relevance of economics for thinking about problems that are pending up there. On the first half of the show, we talked about inequality. Again, another area I don't really think that much about because I care a lot more about how poor people actually live than how unequal their income is relative to somebody else. But I think our guest made some good points that if some of that inequality stems not from people successfully innovating new products that help everybody, but instead stems from differential access to lawyers and lobbyists, then maybe some of that income inequality is bad too. We'll have to think more about that. We'll see you next time.